Joe Biden and Democrats better think twice about unleashing the Green New Deal on the whole country. Just take a look at what's happening in Texas. The state hit with massive power outages from a giant winter storm that's hammering most of the country. 4 million people in the state are in the dark and don't have heat. The cold crippling Texas's power grid, and part of the reason why is because wind turbines are frozen. Half of the state's wind power capacity was reportedly offline. Former Energy Secretary Rick Perry says what's happening in his home state could be a sign of things to come.
If this Green New Deal goes forward the way that the Biden administration appears to want it to, then we'll have more events like we've had in Texas all across the country as we strangle the diversity that we're going to need to keep this country going and keep this country economically powerful.
And the Wall Street Journal editorial board summing things up this way, quote, "Herein is the paradox of the left's climate agenda. The less we use fossil fuels, the more we need them. The Biden administration's plan to banish fossil fuels is a greater existential threat to Americans than climate change." All right, Dana, I know you read that editorial at 6 o'clock this morning, and it makes a great point. You have to have coal, you have to have nuclear as backup in the mix when something like this goes down.
It's a tragic situation. 15 people have lost their lives, and that's just so far. When you don't have heat and you don't have any electricity in the middle of a winter snap like a cold snap like this, it's terrifying. Claire McCaskill, the former senator of Missouri, she tweeted Texans mocking them, saying, "Stay home to stay safe." And she was making fun of them basically because that was what she thinks that a lot of people in Texas did not do during COVID. To me, this is not funny. It's very troubling to look at what the future could bring. So Biden's climate agenda, Jesse, says that by 2035, we'd have 100% renewable energy. Like, I can actually see 2035 from my house. Like, it's not that far from here. I talked to a guy named Dan Turner over at Power the Future. Just a couple of things to note. In 2009, coal-fired power plants generated nearly 37% of the Texas electricity. Wind was 6%. Since then, since 2009, 3 Texas coal-fired power plants have closed. Wind power has more than quadrupled as the transmission lines from that wind got into the urban areas. But in the same period, energy consumption rose by 20%. Because you have all these people that want to move to Texas because it's a better lifestyle, right? How many people? We've shown you how much it costs to get a one-way U-Haul. Kennedy must not like that answer. To get a one-way U-Haul from California to Texas is like $1,000.
Kennedy's truck was powered by a wind turbine. I'm sorry about that, Kennedy.
And Jesse, last night, did you see what happened when Rick Perry was on with Tucker Carlson? The power went out, and Tucker said, "Okay, you're proving my point." Like as we sit here, I am for all sorts of different types of energy mixes. I like solar, great. Yeah. Wind, great. Like have all of it. But the thing is that the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. Coal will burn. We're working on ways to do it more cleanly, but we're not going to get to 100% renewable by 2035. Fingers crossed for good weather is not a sound policy.
I agree with that. And you mentioned Claire McCaskill. Greg, I think someone else on NBC News said something pretty dopey about what's going on down in Texas. Let's roll the tape of Chuck Todd.
The only upside here is I assume the cold weather motivates people to wear a mask because it's one extra layer on your face.
Okay, Greg.
He needs 4 layers on his face, 4 bags around his face. That was stupid. People say stupid things. I have said stupid things. But this is actually a reality check. Yeah. The problem is when it comes to green energy, the people that advocate for it, they don't like reality. Windmills and solar are backup singers. They aren't the lead singer. Gas and coal, that's Tony Orlando. Windmills and solar, that's Dawn. Ironically, the backup singers also need backup singers, and that's the curse of intermittent fuels. They're intermittent, which means they flunk the single most important test of fuel sources, reliability. So and if you change the way you look at windmills, you will actually like them. Windmills are not fuel sources. They are fuel savers. So if they only generate 1% capacity, of the capacity, which is tiny, which has happened in England and in Germany, just 1%, at least you can say, well, hey, we're saving 1% of our coal, right? But when you look at these massive farms, it's not worth it. I think the answer is in front of our face, and we know this. It's nuclear energy. It's clean. It's safe. The Dems, even Greenpeace, former leaders of Greenpeace and other environmental groups are admitting that they were wrong. Sadly, the entertainment industry of the 1970s pretty much dictated our energy policy, and we're still battling our way out of that.
Kennedy, it looks like the people that installed the wind turbines in Texas, they didn't pay that extra $2,000 to install the de-icing technology. That they have this de-icing technology in other windmills all over the country, but they were a little cheap down there in the wind guys with Texas, and it's now costing lives.
That's absolutely right. And we have to ask ourselves, what kind of a country do we want to live in? And what are we willing to sacrifice in the name of the climate cult? Everyone wants a cleaner planet. Everyone wants cleaner energy. But I don't think there's been a thorough investigation, to Greg's point, about really finding new technologies. The private sector is going to do that. But Greg's absolutely right about nuclear and thorium. And there are ways of producing an abundance of clean energy, which they do around the world where they don't have access to natural gas pipelines like they do in Texas. But if you force a green economy too quickly, you are going to sacrifice your economy, and you're no longer going to be living in a first world country. You're going to be living in a third world country where it is very common in places like Venezuela and Zimbabwe to have intermittent blackouts. But guess what? It's no way to live. And when it's cold and people can't go anywhere, they're already immobile and vulnerable, they are going to die. And if you send them to shelters, then they are going to catch COVID and they are going to die. So it's very, very inhumane, and shame on the state government for not having better foresight, not only for a particular storm, but the consequences of this sort of green energy.
Yeah, and our hearts go out to all the people in Texas suffering right now. All right, Juan, tell us how this is all Trump's fault.
Well, let me just introduce a different fact pattern for you, Jesse. Because I was reading today where Dan Woodfin, who's the senior director of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, they run the Texas power grid, which is, by the way, different than most of the country. It is just in Texas. They don't relate to the national power grid. They can't borrow power. Anyway, Mr. Woodfin said this: natural gas and coal are 60% of Texas energy, nuclear energy another 11%. So that's like 70%. Wind is less than a quarter. So what he said was that when you see this failure that we're experiencing in Texas now, it's because gas, coal generators froze up in the midst of this cold snap. That's the big problem, not what's going on with anybody's wind turbine. So I think that when we politicize this and make it an attack on alternative energy sources, when we make this an attack on alternate energy sources, you have to stop and say, oh, are we going to say don't use coal, don't use gas, don't use nuclear because some of those generators froze? We wouldn't say that. We'd say there was a problem, and we'd ask our politicians to do a better job of preparing for a cold weather snap in Texas when most of these generators are oriented to deal with higher electrical demand from, air conditioners during the summer months. But what we're seeing now, I think, is sort of misdirection and political finger pointing by politicians like Governor Abbott, but it doesn't fit the facts. The facts are that coal and gas are the ones who failed in this emergency.
Okay. So all the video that we've seen of the frozen wind turbines, that's fake news, Juan?
It's only
they didn't freeze.
11%.
Those are spinning right now?
They might have. Okay. I repeat, they're only 11%. So 60% coal and gas, that's the problem that has people in the dark and cold.
Okay. Up next, the Cuomo cover-ups.